Now you'll notice that I don't export the code runner context, and there's a good reason for that. Hello friends, welcome to another video. In this one, we're going to be talking about React context and how I implement React context. I kind of do the same thing over and over again for React context. This pattern works really well for me. Maybe it doesn't work for you. I don't know. You let me know if you have any issues with it, and maybe I will enhance this pattern to something that is even more sophisticated. Or maybe less sophisticated. I don't know. We'll see. What am I talking about? Here we are back in my project. Where should we put our context? We should put it in a folder. That's a good idea. That way all of our contexts are all grouped together in a nice little folder. The next thing is, what do we name our context? Well, in this case, I'm going to be using this context to run some code on an external worker. So that's what I'm going to do. Just as a preview, I'm going to need a few files associated with the context. So in this case, I'm going to create a folder for that as well. You don't have to do this. If in your case you have a very simple context, just create a file, it's fine. But since I made a folder, I'm going to make a new file called index.tsx. Now, what will go in this folder? Well, obviously, we're going to need a context, so let's do that. And something that I like to do is add a display name. This can come in handy when you're using the React DevTools extension in your browser. Now, you'll notice that I don't export the code runner context, and there's a good reason for that. I want to have control over how people use this context. I want people to be using it the same way in all of their components with exactly the same parameters and take responsibility for the context inside this file. So there's two things that I always export. The first thing is a hook for the context, and the second thing is a higher order component that provides the context. So let's start with that hook. We're gonna export the useCodeRunner hook. And this will just be a function that returns the useContext. The second thing will be the higher order component. Just as hooks have a convention of using the use keyword, we're gonna use the convention for higher order components, which is the with keyword. Of course, we're gonna need the component that we're going to wrap, which returns a React component itself. So what are we going to return? We're going to return the CodeRunner context provider. This will provide our context to any of the children that I specify here. Well, it's easy in our case because we know exactly what child we're going to use, which is this component. And whatever is returned is going to get some props, and we don't want those props given to the provider. We want them given to the component. So we're just going to sprinkle it on our component. The provider, of course, requires a value. And that's it. This is really what I use in almost every context that I create. It's so easy, and it makes your life really easy as well. Why? Let me show you. Let's pretend we're in another file. Maybe let's call it app.js. And let's say we have a component. As you can see, this is a very simple component. It actually doesn't do anything. But let's say we wanted to use our useCodeRunner hook. And that's how we would use that. But of course, we need to wrap this in our withCodeRunner higher order component. And that's it. With this pair, you can add context to any component. Another common pattern is to export your component from your file. So another way of making this even cleaner is by adding this only to the exported component. And that's it. Of course, the only thing is if you wanted to use this component inside this file, it actually wouldn't work. You would need to use either this app or, outside of this file, this is the only thing that is exported, so it's fine. Now, if you're using JavaScript, this is a pretty good place to stop and maybe move on to the next video. However, if you're using TypeScript, we're gonna go and type all this stuff up right now. First thing is we're gonna type our withCodeRunner higher order component. Well, we know that we're returning a function component, and in my case, I know that this component is always going to be a functional component as well. But notice that this is just a function component with children and no props. That might not be the case, so what we want to do is we want to pass through our type. Basically, this notation means that if this component has a certain type, whatever that is, just pass it on to this function component here. There we go, and you can see our IntelliSense correctly identifying these types. In the next video, we'll be talking about the code runner, and exactly what it does. So we'll do the typing in that video. For now, I think this is fine. I hope you've learned the 3 things that I always do whenever making context. The first thing is make sure your context is in its own file. It doesn't need to be mixed in with other stuff. Just context, own file, and then put all of your context in your project in its own folder. The second thing is to use a hook to export your context. Don't export your context directly, because the context comes with the display name, it comes with a consumer, it comes with a provider. We don't want to expose that to other files. We just want to say, all right, you want to use the context, use it in this with this hook. That's it. The third thing is using a higher order component. Just as I said before, with the context, we don't want to be exporting all this additional stuff. We really want to narrow down the possibilities of how people can be using your context. With a higher order component, if you want any one of your components to have this context provided to it, you should use this higher order component. That's it.